Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
With our newer clients, we often survey what they feel is the largest problem or area of difficulty that they're having in their practice, the area that causes them the most stress. And 60% to 70% of those answers revolve or devolve rather down to three things: new patients, case acceptance, and profitability. Now, I want to take an interesting view of this in the sense of profitability is pretty obvious. I'm not making enough profit, but let's relate back to new patients and case acceptance for a second. If a person is having trouble with new patients, you're not getting enough new patients, and you continue to not get enough new patients, what are you worried about? Your practice is going to shrink, your revenues are going to go down, and what's eventually going to happen? You're going to have less profit. Same thing with case acceptance. I mean, sure, you want to make sure patients are getting the treatment that they need, but ultimately case acceptance has a humongous effect on your overall revenues. So if you're not getting cases accepted, you're going to collect less and hence make less profit. So you could almost say that these 60 or 70% of the answers that we get all revolve or devolve rather, sorry, I keep saying that, back to the concept of not enough profitability. Now, if you're looking to improve profitability, there's a lot of places you could start. You could pull out your P&L and start going through different line items. Let me cut here. Let me do this here. But there are some changes you can make which have a far greater impact than others. There are actually 6 areas or 6 changes, areas you can change, which can drastically improve your profitability quickly. And I'm not saying you would not pay attention to the others, but these 6 are the areas that will get you the biggest bang for your buck. I guess that's sort of a pun. And that's what I want to talk about in this week's and next week's episode. Yes, this is a 2-parter again of Dental Business RX. We're going to look at the top 6 profitability killers in a dental practice. These are areas you can focus on fixing. We'll talk about how to do that. That can give you the quickest increase, immediate increase in profitability. I'm Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And I want to start off with just the top of the list here. We may as well jump right into this. We're going to start with number 1, our biggest profitability killer. Now, before I tell you what it is, what do you think it might be? What expense is it? What is it that you're spending more money on than anything else? Where are you losing the most money? Because I guarantee you, there's a good chance you're not going to guess what this is. Now, the answer may surprise you. It's not even an expense. What it is unrealized or wasted potential. Now, what do I mean by that? Because you might hear something like this: unrealized potential. You have 10 operatories and you're only using 4 or 5. And if we could just use those other 10 ops or something like this, or if I built out a bunch of other rooms in my practice or moved, that is absolutely not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about unrealized potential in the sense of this is income you should be making right now that you're actually not. And there's a different way you could look at this. You could look at it from the perspective of, well, gee, I should have been collecting, $90,000 a month, but I'm only collecting 60. So we need to capitalize on this unrealized potential. That's one way of looking at it. I would suggest you look at it from a different viewpoint in the sense that that's actually an expense. If you have your office is in a position where it should actually be collecting $90,000 a month and you're only collecting 60, you're actually spending $30,000 a month. Look at it from that perspective, or $360,000 a year. And let me give you a couple real life examples of this. And this isn't to, promote our product, but it's to give you an idea of how this works. So we do a series of seminars, 9 days of seminars called the MGE Communication and Sales Seminars. They're seminars A, B, and C. They're each 3 days. And, we do one every month. So 1 month is A, next month is B, next month is C, and then the following month is A. We've been doing these for, since the early 90s, since the first Clinton administration, all right? And what do we go over in these seminars? How to communicate and sell better, get patients to want what they need. And what type of an increase do we normally see? Close to $300,000 in the first year is the average increase for every client that comes in. So what do we normally see? How does this work out? A client will come to their first ABC. They'll sit there 3 days. They'll learn. They'll go back to their practice. And the usual thing we'll see is a 10, 20, sometimes more $1,000 increase in collections, not production, the first month back. So if they come to a seminar in April, May is up by 10, 20, or plus $1,000 in May. And then it's sustained growth too. It continues to grow. Now, I want to point something out about this. So what did this person do when they went back to their office? He or she went back, and because they now have new communication skills, they were able to talk to patients. Most likely, these aren't all new patients either, folks. These are patients of record as well. Patients they had spoken to before that didn't accept treatment or accepted partial treatment, and new patients that normally would not have accepted treatment. And now those patients are saying yes instead of saying no, or I want to think about it. And what's the impact? A 10, 20,000 plus increase in their collections that month. The reason I bring this up is they didn't go back and add a bunch of chairs. They didn't go back and hire a bunch of staff. If they were doing any marketing, it probably didn't even have time to kick in that first month. Maybe mid the second month, they would start to see some beneficial effects from their marketing efforts. Marketing takes some time. So all that changed was how the doctor was talking to patients. So now, yeah, that's cool, right? But now let's look at this from the perspective of what was really happening here. So you have this doctor, they were doing $60,000 a month. They go back to their practice and now they're doing 80. They didn't add a bunch of expenses. Maybe a couple variable expenses went up, lab or supplies. Maybe they had to bring in a temp assistant, but it didn't eat up a ton of their overhead. All right. So that potential for collections was always there. That was there the month before they came to the ABCs. That was there the month before that. It probably has been there for years. They just were not capitalizing on it. It was always there. They didn't have to spend more money to realize that potential. So let's take an example like that. A doctor who goes from 60 to 80, they made an additional 20,000 in collections that month that was unrealized. They could look at it as, they were losing that money. They're actually better off looking at it as an expense. That doctor was effectively spending $20,000 a month every month and then finally stopped spending it by realizing their true potential. Now, I guarantee you, if I were to look at that doctor's P&L, that $20,000 a month, there is no other expense that they have that's that large. That is probably their largest expense. So if you want to look at later, what is number one profitability killer? Because what's the overhead or not the overhead equation, the profit equation? It's essentially revenues in and expenses, right? So you could make a lot of money and spend a lot of money, in which case you have no profit, or you could make a moderate amount of money and not spend a lot and have more profit. So they're both are half of the profit equation. So in this case, we're taking care of the first half, which is we're just realizing the level of income potential that you should be having right now without incurring a lot more expense. And sometimes it's frustrating to explain this because this is, I guarantee you, this is happening to you. And if you don't believe me, take a look at who's on your recall schedule Monday or Tuesday and look at all the incomplete treatment. I'm not talking about new patients because you have no idea what you're going to see with a new patient. They may need treatment, they may not. Look at your patients of record. How much incomplete treatment do you have? Sure, there's lots of good reasons that they're not doing it. All right. But how many of those cases that needed 6 crowns are only doing 2 because that's what insurance is going to cover? This is where you're losing a ton of potential revenue. And not only that, it's not even just about the money. That's actually the least important consideration. You're not actually getting a patient as healthy as they could be. So that is, from a profitability killer perspective, this is number one. This is what's costing you the most every month. And you can even extend this out. See, these are things, again, we don't have to build out the office or do this or do that to realize this. These are things that you have to make very small changes to for a huge impact. Here's another one, and I've talked about this before. Let's talk about your new patient intake process. So, I've gone over this in prior episodes. I think in the reception episode, I really drilled down on this hard, but the average conversion rate for incoming new patient calls is 23% in the United States. So out of 100 calls, 23 people actually come into the office as a new patient. Well, if you were just to tweak that a little bit and get that conversion rate up from 23% to 50%, and you're getting 100 calls a month, that's an additional 27 more new patients per month. So this is the point I would throw out to you. If you're getting 23 new patients a month, chances are you're getting, on average, 100 inquiries a month. Now, some of those inquiries are people calling the office going, how much do you charge for a crown? And you might think that, well, people who do that aren't the types that I want as a patient. That's absolutely not true. Shoppers, we're all shoppers. We've all bought things on sale. That's how that works. And chances are if they're calling in because they want to know how much a crown costs, they need more than one crown. So if you could expertly handle that person to actually get them to show up, That's potential revenue for the practice. It's also a potential new patient. But let's just look at this from a sheer numbers perspective. The average first year revenues from a new patient in the U.S. is $1,200 in a dental office, $1,200 in the first year. That's the average. Some people need a lot of work, some people need little. And this isn't even with a great sales team or sales process in place. This is average. So if I have an office that's getting 100 new patient phone calls a month and we're converting 23 of those, and I were to fix my intake process a little bit, work on my receptionist skills a little bit, and get that up to 50%, now we're getting 50 new patients a month. That's an additional 27 more new patients per month. That's at $1,200 a new patient. That's $32,000 in additional revenue per month. And how much did I have to spend to make that $32,000? Pretty much nothing. Absolutely nothing. So if you want to look at where you are, again, it's a little bit of a different mentality, where you're spending the most money in your practice right now. And this isn't pie in the sky, folks. This is where you're spending the most money is the potential that you have right now that you're just not realizing. That is profitability killer number one. And how does this affect overhead? Well, you've probably been asked before, what's your overhead? What's your overhead percentage? Questions like this. We've all heard questions of this nature. Well, let's say your office is doing $60,000 a month and your overhead is 40. Well, then your overhead percentage is 67%. So let's say, you go from 60 to 80 because you learn to sell a bit better, communicate a bit better with more impact. So you go from 60 to 80. All you had to spend to go from 60 to 80 was improving your own communication and case presentation skills. So you're not spending a lot on other expenses. Sure, your lab and your supplies are going to be a little higher, but not much. So if you go to 80 and you still had that overhead of 40 before, now your overhead's 50%. If we account for a couple of other variable expenses, maybe it's 55. So you've gone from 67 to 55% overhead by just maximizing what you already have. So because overhead percentage, when you hear these numbers, are a function of revenues. We're relating it back to revenues. So if we can raise your revenues without increasing the expenses, and this is one way you can do it, it's one of the major ways you can do it, you've effectively drastically increased your profitability. So that's the big one. What are our other 5 areas? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to lay out what they are, and then I'm just going to go down them, step by step, as well as giving you a few ideas about how to fix these. Let's take a look at the next profitability killer. The next one is loans and leases. And by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. I have a link for the ABCs, I'm sorry, we call them around here, the MGE Communication and Sales Seminars if you want to check them out. I also have a link on the episode webpage for the MGE overhead sheet. On the overhead sheet, you have about 20 different items that appear on most dentists' overhead. And we made this in response to years and years back because I'd have a client sit in front of me, tell me their overhead was 40. And then when I started to dig in, it was actually 50. They were missing accounting for a lot of different expenses. So this overhead sheet is very thorough and very complete, and it really accounts for everything that you spend. So there's about 20 different categories. We're going to be focusing on, from here forward, about 5 of them, right? The 5 big ones that are left. I also have a handout that you can download as well, which is overhead guidelines, where we kind of break down the percentage by category in relation to the overhead sheet. You can see, for instance, that your rent should not exceed 4 to 5% of revenue. Those are available for you on the episode webpage if you want to go ahead and download them, because I'll be referring back to it. All right, so let's take a look at loans and leases. Why do we normally have trouble in these categories? So we're taking these 5 categories that remain, and these are categories that we've seen have the tendency to be the quickest that go out of control and cost you a lot of profit. Loans and leases are normally a problem in a dental practice, not because it's a newer office and they're paying for new equipment. It's because equipment purchases are made that actually don't have commensurate financial value to the practice. It's a kind of a fancy way of saying, essentially, you're buying a piece of equipment that is costing you more than you're actually making from it. So this is where, and look, I understand. I'm a bit of a tech nerd. I like technical things. I get into it, and I've been to various types of dental trade shows and other trade shows, and I just zero right in on the new pieces of technology, the talking defibrillator or this or that. I love this stuff. And I get it. So, here's a new machine that makes crowns. Here's a new machine, we can get a CAT scan machine for the office. These are all very, very cool. And I'm not saying you should not have these things. You want to have the best equipment you can have to service your patients to the best of your ability. But then this is where you have to evaluate in certain cases. We've seen this before. I remember this years back when CIRIC was just coming up and becoming a big thing. I saw people with CIRIC machines that were spending, their lease payment was whatever it was at the time, $1,200, $1,600 a month. And they they would have spent less with the number of crowns that they were doing if they had just sent their crowns to a lab. So their lab bill was $500 a month, and they're leasing a CIRIC now, and the CIRIC is costing them more than their lab used to cost them. Plus there's the labor where they actually have to do something with the CIRIC to make a crown, all to advertise same-day crowns. So, this is if the same-day crowns was such a huge marketing button, so to speak, then you would expect them to be doing more crowns, which in this case they weren't. I'm not saying that it isn't, but that's just how it worked out for these folks. The amount of crowns they were doing that they could have used a CIRIC for at that time were not enough to justify them purchasing a CIRIC. What they should have done is actually gotten the number of crowns that they were doing up, either by increasing case acceptance or getting more patient flow, and then go get a CIRIC. Same thing with a CAT scan. If you need a CAT scan machine, you might want to take a look at, well, how many would you be doing a month? Or is it better off to just outsource it, to have them go elsewhere to get the CAT scan done? Is it going to cover your lease payment with the revenue you're going to be making from doing these CAT scans? So this is where I see this tends to go wrong, is a doctor will buy a piece of equipment with the hope of increased productivity, but that new productivity doesn't materialize because they were expecting that new piece of equipment to increase productivity on its own. Purchasing equipment to assist with increasing profitability or productivity is fine, but just because you have a machine doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're going to magically make more money. I've seen people do this with moving an office. They're in a smaller practice. They're not maxed out. Everything's going great. The equipment's pretty decent, but it's getting to be a bit of an older office. You could use a paint job or whatever, but then you see this beautiful location for lease down the street. It's right where you want to be, and you can open up to 4 more chairs, and this is really exciting. I mean, the rent's going to double, but this is great. We're ready to grow. So you move, and you're expecting the move is going to magically make your practice grow, and then it doesn't. So what happens? You're maybe doing the same or a little bit more in revenue, but what's actually occurring is you're spending more, so the profitability goes down. So anytime you're going to jump into something with a long-term commitment, you have to look at, all right, is this going to make me more revenue? I mean, obviously, the consideration of quality of care is there. You can't have something that lowers or makes your quality of care unacceptable. But you have to look at, how is this going to impact revenues? If I buy this machine, how is it going to impact revenues? Does it actually work out from a numbers perspective? And you won't tend to go wrong. All right, so that's our first category. So second category or area, biggest profitability killer, is marketing and public relations. So if you see a high marketing and PR budget, and if you look at our overhead guideline sheet, the one that I had talked to you about earlier where it gives you the percentage by category, on here we have advertising marked down between 3 and 5%. Now, one thing I should say, as far as a percentage goes, is the amount you want to spend on marketing and public relations, let's just say marketing, really depends on how aggressively you want to grow. So if you're a newer practice or you're going through a big expansion phase, that percentage might be higher. But if the marketing's working, you would expect to see a commensurate change in revenues shortly thereafter. In other words, if I spend more on marketing and I double my new patients, you would expect to see the impact in my collections, that month, the following month, the month after, and so on. Where you normally see these marketing budgets out of whack, where you don't see that, expected return, really goes back to about 3 things. The first thing has to do with what people consider marketing is actually supposed to do. Now, it's funny because I survey every time I have a seminar with newer clients. I'll ask when we're talking about new patient marketing, what is marketing supposed to do? Why are you marketing your dental practice? What are you trying to do? I mean, answer that question if you'd like. And 90% of the people, what is it supposed to do, will answer, it's supposed to get me new patients. And that's correct. Ultimately, it will. But let's say you're doing Facebook advertising. You're advertising on Facebook. You're doing, paid pay-per-click on Facebook. And I see an ad for your practice and I click it. all that that's going to create is either I'm going to fill out a form or I'm going to make a phone call. So really all marketing does is create a phone call. It doesn't create a new patient. I'm not going to see your Facebook ad in my feed and then just show up at your office and say, hey, I'm here. I saw you on Facebook. I mean, I know some people might do that, but for the most part, it's going to create an inquiry. So if we want to know whether our marketing is effective or not, we have to look at, is it actually creating people contacting our practice? If it's not, then it's ineffective. And in the long run, it's actually more expensive to continue an ineffective marketing campaign than to stop, scrap it, and start all over again. Now, one thing I'll warn you about is I've seen some people will do marketing and it quote unquote doesn't work. So then they just decide they're going to not do marketing. That's a terrible idea. You need to do marketing. Your practice has to get new patients. So if it's not working, the solution is not to do it at all. It's to fix whatever's going wrong. Now, how do we know our marketing's working? It's creating inquiries. It's creating calls. It's creating interest. People are reaching into our office wanting to know about a particular service or product. That is the job of marketing. So the first reason someone might be spending too much on marketing is their marketing just isn't getting enough inquiries, or the amount you're spending per inquiry is too high. And look, I get through these numbers out and you could sit there and go, it's just too many numbers and I don't want to deal with that or whatever. All I would tell you is, sorry, you own a business. If you own a business, you got to know these numbers, and these are not that difficult to deal with. One thing you want to keep track of, there's actually two major things you want to keep track of beyond new patients. One, you want to keep track of how many actual inquiries you get into the practice on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. There's different names for this. You could call it a new reach, meaning someone's reaching into the office. You could call it a new lead. You could call it a new patient inquiry. Whatever you want to call it is fine. But this is basically anybody who contacts the practice, fills out a form, calls the office, inquiring about becoming a new patient. And yes, that would include shopper calls. If someone calls your office asking how much a crown costs, unless it's really secretly the doctor down the street who's price checking, and they shouldn't be doing that. But anybody who calls your practice and they give you their contact info, which you should be getting right when you answer the phone, and is asking about something in your office, potentially to become a new patient, that is an inquiry. So we want to compare inquiries to number of new patients, right? That's why we're keeping this statistic. So then the next thing that we want to keep track of, in addition to inquiries and new patients, is we want to know what our acquisition cost is. Because this is really sort of the test of any marketing. How much did we have to spend to get that phone call? How much did we have to spend to get that phone call? Because then you'll start to build a bit of a comparative. Maybe you're doing Google and you're doing Facebook and you're doing postcards, and you find out that, well, postcards cost us, $200 for a phone call, and Facebook costs us $225, and Google pay-per-click costs us $150. I'm not saying these are real numbers, but this is what you want to keep track of. So this is why keeping track of these things at reception is not an optional thing or a quote-unquote cool things to do. This is why we've talked about having a new patient log before it. It's not optional to keep in place. If you don't have these numbers accurately kept, it's virtually impossible to tell whether your marketing is working or not. So you want number of calls or leads or reaches, whatever you want to call it. And then you want to know how much are you spending to create this call, lead, or reach. So here's an example. Let's say I spend $10,000 on a postcard campaign. I send out 20,000 postcards in a month. I send out maybe 5,000 a week. So I look, and out of those 20,000 postcards that I sent out, I got 200 phone calls. All right, 200 phone calls, 20,000 postcards. And I spent $10,000 on this. So I spent $10,000 for 200 phone calls. So how much did I spend per call? I spent $50 to get a phone call. Is that right? You do my math? Yeah. Yep. Spent $50. There you go. I don't have a calculator here. Sometimes my math works. Sometimes it doesn't. So I spent $50 a call. That's how much each phone call cost me. So I want to know that number, because then let's say I'm trying to compare it up against, let's say the office is growing and I want to increase my marketing budget a bit. Well, then I'd want to look at, well, where am I going to put this marketing money? Well, let's say I look at my Google pay-per-click and I go, okay, I'm spending this much to get a click or a call. Let's say I'm spending $75 for a click or a call, but I'm only spending $50 for the postcards. Well, then from an investment perspective, I might be better served spending a little bit more money for a few more postcards, assuming there's enough people close to my office that fit the criteria that I want to market to. Do you see? So you have to know this acquisition cost number. Now, the cool thing about this, and this has nothing to do with well, it does, but it's not completely related, is if I have a really good referral program, and let's say I spent $50 for a phone call and I converted this patient, if I get them to refer me somebody else, I actually just brought that cost for that call down to $25. So I got 2 new patients for 1. Or even if my receptionist is very skilled at this, when they get that call and they're talking to this prospective new patient, and then they start asking about, is there anybody else, in your household that needs a dentist? Yeah, as a matter of fact, my wife and my teenage son need a dentist as well. Well, we're doing this new patient special. I can get all 3 of you in. Well, now for that $50, I got 3 new patients. Do you see? I just lowered the acquisition cost. So that's why referrals are a good thing to have. But that's the first thing I'm going to want to know is my leads, my acquisition cost, and then my new patients, of course. So if I'm spending a lot of money and I'm not getting a lot of new inquiries, that's a problem. That's one reason why marketing as a percentage of overhead starts to go out of whack. The other reason why marketing will go out of whack, and this may be, a little, not as common, but it happens, is someone gets the idea that if I do a piece of mail from my office, or if I do this from my office, I have to spend a lot of money and put gold leaf on it so that it looks really beautiful, which I'm fine for, letterhead and things like this. But if I'm sending out a postcard, I'm not going to emboss a postcard and do this and do that to make it super fancy and spend $1.50 a postcard. That's just a waste of money. You get this kind of exaggerated idea of what your postcard is supposed to look at, because let's be honest, if you got a 1% response on a postcard, that would be awesome. Just so you guys know, the average percent response on a postcard mailing is going to be 0.25%, 0.25. So if I send out 1,000 postcards, I can expect 2.5 phone calls. If I send out 10,000, I can expect 25 phone calls. That's the average, 0.25%. Okay. So most cases, if I send out a postcard, where are most of these postcards going to end up? In the recycle bin, hopefully, or the trash. That's where they're going to go. All right. So I don't want to blow too much money on those. I don't want to make them look ugly or unattractive, but I don't want them to be, I'm not going to sink a ton of money into them. Otherwise, if I'm going to sink money into something, it's going to be to promotion or promotional materials that I'm going to hand patients. That's where I'm going to sink money, or give prospective referrals, because that's not going to go out as in high of a volume. But, so if I spend $1 on this really nice folder with all this stuff in it to give to a prospective patient that's in the office, or a new patient that's in the office, I'm not giving that many of those out versus mailing out 10 or 20,000 of them. So that's another reason your marketing budget can go out of whack. We have either the marketing's not getting reaches or leads, or I've spent too much money on the individual pieces. The third reason, and we were just talking about this a minute ago, has to do with the effectiveness of my receptionist. The effectiveness of my receptionist. So if my receptionist isn't very effective and is only converting 23% of patients, which is the national average, then remember let's do the math now. I spent $50 a phone call, right? And I gave you the example earlier, I had 200 phone calls. Let's take 100 of those. So for those 100 phone calls, I spent $5,000. Because I spent $50 a call. And then we convert 23 of those new patients. So effectively, I spent $5,000 for 23 new patients. So without getting into the specific math, I've effectively taken now, let's look at our acquisition cost now. I spent $50 for each call, but I only converted 23 out of 100. So for those 23 new patients, I'm spending over $200 for each new patients, because I spent $5,000 to get those 100 calls and I only got 23. So now I'm at $200+ per new patient. All right. So again, if I were to increase that to 50% from 23%, that's an additional 27 new patients. I've now spent $5,000 for 100 calls, and 50 new patients, I'm spending $100 per new patient. You get the general idea, right? We don't have to get crazy with the math, but I wanted you to start thinking with this. Now, last point I'll cover on this marketing thing, because I can't say it enough, and especially We're getting a considerable number of questions, especially from newer clients. Are we in a recession? Are we going into a recession? I know this is a big point of debate in society right now. And the only thing I'd bring up, I'm going to do an episode on this, but let's just step back for a second. If you've been open when there has ever been a recession, the last one that I believe we had was back in the right after the housing crash back in 0809. What happens when you're in a recession? You have reduced economic activity, right? So half the problem with a recession is not what's actually happening. It's what people think is happening. If I'm at home and we're in a recession, economic activity has contracted, you may lose your job, from our faithful friends at the news. Well, then I'm going to be, as an individual, less apt to spend money on things that maybe I would have been willing to spend money on before. Right. So maybe I'm putting off elective treatment at that point because, we're in a recession. I might lose my job. So there's sort of the mental factor that goes along with it beyond the actual reality of people who are actually losing their job to reduced economic activity. The only thing I'll say specifically with regards to, recessions or economic slowdowns, things of that nature, and it is kind of a unique economic situation right now, is if you're going to be in that situation, imagine that you're sailing a boat on the ocean. I guess you'd sail a ship on the ocean, but you're in a ship on the ocean and you know that there is stormy water ahead, or you think that there might be stormy waters ahead. You'd want to make sure that everything is in tip-top shape. Nothing is running poorly. There's no problems. Your pumps are working. There's no leaks. The crew knows exactly what they're supposed to do if things go wrong. You want to make sure that you are proofed against problems to the greatest degree possible. All right. So there are certain areas that you're going to want to look at. Some of the things that I've brought up thus far are important, especially you don't want to overspend. You don't want to spend money on things that aren't going to have any form of return. You don't want to waste potential in your business. And the last point I bring up, and this relates to marketing, has to do with managed care. And I know I talk about this a lot, especially PPOs and HMOs. But this is a problem, and I want you to look at it from a little bit of a different perspective for a second. If let's say you have PPOs in your practice and you are writing off, 25% on these PPOs, and that's low. Normally with PPOs, it's going to be higher, but let's say the average write-off is 25%. If it's your crown's normally $1,000, you're getting $750. It's usually way worse than this. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, say that's what it is. Let's say the majority of your practice is PPO. All right, well then, effectively, you're producing, let's say in an average month, you're producing $80,000. Well, then you're collecting only $60,000. $80,000 at full fee to collect $60,000 at your reduced PPO fee. You're effectively writing off $20,000 a month. Now, there's a few problems with this from an expense perspective. You're spending the amount that you would normally need to spend to produce $80,000. Your assistant isn't charging you less because you're in a PPO or this is a PPO patient. Your landlord's not charging you less. The supplier's not charging you less. And the lab is not charging you less. So you're paying full fee on all of that. You're just not collecting full fee. But you're only collecting 80% of your normal fee in this PPO, or 75% of your normal fee in this PPO. So I want you to look at it from this perspective. That effectively, that $20,000, if you produced 80 and collected 60, that was your marketing budget for that month. 20 grand, 25%. Because why are you participating in a PPO to begin with? You're participating to get patients. Well, that's what you spend money on marketing for, to get patients. So if I'm spending $20,000 a month in write-offs, that's my marketing budget. You can look at our overhead guidelines. There's no way I would recommend that you spend 25% per month on marketing. I would expect you to be quadrupling your practice every 3 months if you were spending that much. So, and the worst part of that is if I spend, $250 on a postcard, for per patient on a postcard, acquisition cost, I'm only spending that once. With a PPO, you're spending it every time you're treating the patient. If I'm a PPO patient in your practice, you're spending it every time you do a crown on me or any type of a procedure. You're spending that every single time. It's an acquisition cost that never goes away. So I just ask you to look at it from the perspective of this is actually marketing expense and it doesn't work long term and it will completely skew your overhead percentages if you're involved in PPOs, which you'll hear as I go through this, but it will make certain expenses seem to be higher than they should. Let's take a look at how this impacts expenses overall. Let's say your rent is $4,000 a month. All right, well, if you're collecting $80,000, then your rent is 5%, which is well within the range. It's actually right at the top of the range that we recommend for rent expense in the practice. Well, let's say you're producing $80,000 a month if it was at full fee, but you're only collecting $60,000 because you're involved in a bunch of PPOs. All right, well, now your rent is between 6 and 7% per month, that $4,000, because you're not collecting what you should. You see how it tends to skew your overhead numbers. That's what tends to happen. So long term, this is something that you're going to want to drop out of. There's different ways that you want to do it. Obviously, it really depends on the amount of PPO infiltration in your practice. So, there's different ways I'd recommend doing it. Okay. So I think I've burned up the time that I've allotted for this week so far. Sorry about that, folks. I took a little longer than I wanted to on a few of these things. We still have 3 major expense areas to discuss. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to end off this episode here. We'll pick up next week. Now, a few things. The links to the various downloads that I mentioned are on the episode webpage. In addition, one thing we do offer if you're looking for help increasing profitability, because this is a very individualized situation. It really depends on what's going on in your practice. We do offer a free overhead and profitability coaching session. You can click the link on the episode webpage, or when you do your downloads, it'll ask you if you want one of these. You can check that out as well. Otherwise, if you have any questions about anything I've covered in this week's episode, you can email me at jeffb@mgeonline.com. Give us a call at 800-640-1140 or visit us online at mgeonline.com. I will see you next week. We're going to get into these last 3 expense categories and pull them apart and look at how you can save some money in them. Until then, do great. Talk to you then.